August 1612. Inside Lancaster Castle. England, there was a room built not to discover truth, but to preserve fear. The ceiling was low. The stone walls were thick. The light was so weak that even at midday, the room felt like dusk. When the heavy wooden doors closed, the damp smell of old stone mixed with sweat, with fear, and with something harder to name. The kind of smell that appears when people understand their fate is being decided by men who will never face the consequences. Those led into the room had been waiting for this moment for months in the dungeons below. They were thin, their clothes torn, their skin pale from the absence of sunlight. Some trembled from cold, some from hunger, and some because they understood exactly what they were standing before. On the raised platform, the judges sat upright in dark robes, faces stern and unreadable. They represented the law. But in this century, the law and God were the same. And when those two merge, mercy is usually the first thing to disappear. They called the people standing below them by a single name, witches. It did not matter who they had been before, how they had lived, who they had loved, or what they had feared. That word erased everything. It turned the poor into enemies of order, enemies of God, enemies of the king. And yet even as the air in the room grew heavy enough to choke on the trial had not yet reached the moment that would scar history. That moment did not arrive with a gavel or a sentence. It arrived with a child. A side door of the courtroom opened. A soldier stepped in first, then stopped. Behind him came a small figure so slight that for a moment many did not even register her presence. The child was lifted and placed standing on a wooden table at the center of the room. The table stood higher than the accused, but lower than the judge's bench, as if someone had deliberately positioned her exactly where a sacrifice should stand. Her name was Janet Devise. She was 9 years old. Pause here for a moment. Picture it. A room full of grown men accustomed to command to judgment, to deciding who lives and who dies. And at the center of that room stands a thin child balanced on a table, her hands clasped together as if trying to hold herself in place. In their world, children were not merely weak. Children were considered pure, untouched by adult sin, closer to God. And because of that, when speaking of the devil, the words of a child were sometimes considered more trustworthy than those of any adult present. Janet's mother, Elizabeth Devise, recognized her immediately. She screamed not in anger, but with the sound of someone who understands exactly what is about to happen and is utterly powerless to stop it. She shouted her daughter's name, thrashing as the guards restrained her. For a brief moment, Janet began to cry. A short, choked sound, a very childish sound. Someone in the room lowered their head, but no one stood. No one said this was wrong. Elizabeth was dragged from the chamber. The door slammed shut. The sound echoed like a verdict. Janet wiped her face with her sleeve. She took a deep breath. And then something changed. Not in her, but in the room. Silence spread thick and expectant. Every eye fixed on the child, as if she were the final key that would unlock the monster they believed was hiding among them. Janet began to speak. Her voice did not shake. She did not panic. She did not speak as if imagining. She spoke as if reciting something memorized. "My mother is a witch," she said. "I know this. I have seen her spirit. In the form of a brown dog. It asked her what she wanted it to do, and she told it to kill people." The words fell into the room like cold water. No one asked how a child could know such things. No one questioned how she could separate fear from imagination or imagination from truth. Those questions were unnecessary, because in this era, truth was not the priority. Safety was. And if the deaths of a few could purchase the feeling of safety, then the price was acceptable. Janet continued. She spoke of the gathering at Malkin Tower, of those who were present, of food shared, of whispered conversations, of murderous intent. She named names calmly, precisely. The accused stood there listening to a child describe them as if they were strangers, as if they were creatures pulled from a nightmare. and they understood there was no path back. No matter what they said, they could not compete with the image before them, a child on a table speaking with certainty about evil living inside her own family. The most terrifying thing in that room was not the accusations of witchcraft or magic. It was how easily everyone accepted them, the calm of those in power, the silence of the crowd. No one asked whether a child truly understood what death meant when she spoke of killing. No one wondered how she would live after speaking these words, because in that moment, Janet Device was no longer seen as a child. She was a tool, evidence, the perfect voice to legitimize a verdict that had already been decided. The Lancaster courtroom that day resembled a cathedral warped into something unholy. Law played the role of God, fear replaced faith, and the poor became offerings meant to soothe a panicked society. At the center of that ritual stood a child on a wooden table, speaking words that would hang an entire family. And before we go any further, before we descend deeper into Janet Device's story, there is a question you must carry with you. Not to answer yet, but to let it cling to you as this story unfolds. In that dark room, who was truly speaking a 9-year-old child, or the fear of an entire world desperate to find a monster to kill just so it could believe it was still safe. Before Janet Device stepped onto the wooden table at the center of the Lancaster courtroom, before her voice became the most powerful evidence against her own family, Janet had already spent her childhood in a place the law never reached. It was a fringe of the world, a place where people existed without ever being fully acknowledged as part of any order. Janet was born there, and from the moment she opened her eyes to life, she learned a crucial lesson. Some children are born to be protected, and some are born to figure out how to survive on their own. Janet was born illegitimate. In early 17th century England, this was not merely a private shame. It was a public marker that the child had no secure place in society, no lawful father, no lineage to shield her. No one is obligated to intervene if she was harmed or abandoned. Janet carried her mother's name, Elizabeth Device, a poor woman living on the margins of Lancashire villages. The Device family owned no land, held no stable occupation, and possessed nothing resembling social standing. They lived on what society left behind: pity handouts and a fragile form of survival known as cunning craft. Cunning craft was not the dark sorcery the judges would later describe. It was a scattered collection of folk knowledge, simple remedies, old prayers, small charms meant to find lost objects or soothe pain. For the poor, it was a way to stay alive, but to a society increasingly obsessed with the devil, it was suspicious. The Device family existed in that dangerous gray zone where the line between survival and accusation was so thin that a single rumor could collapse it. Janet grew up in poverty, but hunger and worn clothing were not what she lacked most. What she lacked was protection. No one ever told her the world was safe. No one stepped in when watchful eyes began turning toward her family. Janet learned to observe early. She listened to adult conversations, to whispered fears about witches, devils, and nameless disasters. In cold, crowded homes, she absorbed everything not as a carefree child, but as a small creature trying to understand the unspoken rules of the world so she would not be crushed by them. Children born into safety rarely need to understand how power truly works. Janet did. She saw how poverty made people invisible and how that invisibility made them perfect targets. She watched her mother regarded with a mixture of fear and contempt. She understood that her family was not considered part of the community, but something outside it, something that could be blamed when necessary. In that world, truth did not always determine fate. What mattered was collective fear and the urgent need to attach that fear to a name. Children like Janet often develop a particular awareness. They see what adults refuse to face directly, not because they are wiser, but because they have no choice. They learn that silence can be more dangerous than speech, and that saying the right thing may be the only way to survive. Janet grew up with this understanding even if she never named it. By the time accusations began to circle the Device family, by the time suspicion swelled like a quiet tide, Janet had already been standing near the center of the storm, long before anyone else realized it. In a society like Lancaster in 1612, an unprotected child stood before two roles it never chose for itself. Either it would become the first sacrifice, a small life crushed to satisfy communal fear and anger, or it would become a speaking vessel, a channel through which adults could release what they dared not say aloud themselves. Janet drifted toward the second role, not through conscious decision, but through survival instincts sharpened by years of neglect. When Janet spoke of devils of witches, of evil hiding within her own home, she was not simply repeating what she had heard. She was reflecting the world around her in a form that the world was prepared to believe. A child saying what no one else dared, wrapped in an innocence that made her words impossible to challenge. In that moment, Janet was no longer a poor, unprotected girl. She became what society needed: living proof, confirmation that their fear was justified, that the violence about to unfold was righteous. No one in the courtroom considered how Janet would continue living after that day, because once a child is used to legitimize destruction, childhood ends long before the sentence is delivered. Janet Devise, a child born outside the margins of the world, learned how to exist in a society that depended on small, vulnerable lives like hers to speak the words adults could not bear to confront. And in that space between survival and exploitation, Janet's story becomes as terrifying as any accusation of witchcraft or demonic evil. Janet Devise did not grow up in a home. She grew up in a landscape that had already been condemned before she ever cried for the first time. When people spoke of Pendle, they did not use the language of geography, but the language of suspicion. Early 17th century Lancashire was not a forgotten, peaceful countryside. It was a dark stain on the nation's memory, a place where evil was believed not to hide, but to linger openly because it was already expected. Pendle Hill rose from the earth like an ancient growth, not sharp, not majestic, but heavy. It did not dominate the land through height, but through pressure. Its slopes were stripped by wind, its fog hanging low, thick as a second skin, pressing against the lungs of those who lived nearby. On some mornings, the hill vanished completely swallowed by mist, and people swore that in those moments, Pendle was not something to be seen, but something to be felt, like a presence watching from behind. The path up the hill did not invite travelers. Muddy ground, sharp stones, winding tracks that seemed designed to mislead strangers. This was not a space meant for passing through, but for being trapped. Villages huddled at the foot of the hill, as if hiding from what loomed above them. Houses were low, thatched roofs, heavy with rain windows, narrow like eyes, afraid to open too wide. People lived close together, yet rarely trusted one another. And within that strained closeness, every action became vulnerable to being read as a sign of guilt. Lancashire carried a permanent mark of suspicion in the eyes of central power. It was believed to be Catholic. In an England still reeling from the gunpowder plot, where fear of betrayal remained hot like embers, Catholicism was no longer merely a faith. It was an accusation suspended in the air. In places like Pendle, no wrongdoing was required to be suspected. Praying slightly differently, holding on to an old custom or missing church at the wrong moment was enough to be remembered. That suspicion seeped into every corner of daily life. It turned folk stories into liabilities. Whispered tales of spirits, devils, and people who practiced cunning craft were no longer ways of understanding the world. They became potential evidence. In Pendle, words were never harmless. A whisper could outlive the person who spoke it. A rumor could grow, change shape, until it became heavy enough to crush an entire family. The hill stood there silent. It neither confirmed the stories attached to it nor denied them. And that silence was the most frightening thing of all. Because in a society obsessed with uncovering evil, silence was never understood as innocence. Silence meant concealment. Silence meant complicity. Silence meant that something was waiting to be revealed. People began to say that Pendle was where witches gathered, that the poor houses around its base were not merely human dwellings, but places the devil visited. Malkin Tower, with its decayed appearance and a name already heavy with contempt, became the focal point of that diseased imagination. A poor house was no longer simply poor, it became a lair. A family surviving on begging and folk remedies was no longer desperate. They became people who lived off darkness. At Pendle, geography began to turn into morality. The hill was no longer just earth and stone, it became evidence. And once a place is labeled evil, the people living within it rarely have any chance of being seen as good. A child born under the shadow of Pendle Hill carried an invisible burden. She was not only the child of a poor family, but the child of a land already cursed in the minds of others. Janet Device grew up breathing that air. She learned to observe before she learned to speak, to listen before she learned to resist. On nights when the wind howled around Malkin Tower, when fog thickened enough to swallow the moon, Pendle Hill remained heavy and silent. It witnessed the whispers, the suspicious glances, the slow accumulation of fear, like groundwater beneath the soil. It watched a community convince itself that evil must exist somewhere, and that the most logical place to put it was here. Pendle did not speak. It did not need to. In a world searching for witches, a single hill deemed different was enough to plant the seeds of catastrophe. And from that silent land, the stories would travel far into brightly lit courtrooms, where they would no longer be rural rumors, but truths recognized and enforced by law. From Pendle Hill, if one traveled far enough south, the road would eventually lead to London. But it was not a seamless journey. Between the silent hill and the English throne lay a dense void of fear. And within that void, a crowned man was listening to whispers no one else could hear. James Stuart King. James I of England was not a ruler defined by calm authority. He ascended the throne carrying a heavy past and an imagination stretched taut as wire. Before becoming King of England, he had ruled Scotland, a land where stories of witches, devils, and pacts with darkness did not exist solely in folklore, but seeped into theology and politics alike. James grew up in a world where evil was not an abstract idea. It was taught, preached, and repeated until it became a living presence in the mind. Then came the Gunpowder Plot. In 1605, only a few years after James took the English crown, a conspiracy to destroy Parliament was uncovered. Guy Fawkes and his accomplices were captured, and barrels of gunpowder were discovered beneath the very heart of royal power. The king survived, but from that moment on, death was no longer a distant possibility. It had been close. And a man who has nearly been erased by fire and smoke rarely forgets what that feels like. From then on, James lived in a state of constant vigilance. Every difference could signal rebellion. Every unexplained event could conceal a conspiracy. In the candlelit halls of the palace, where flickering flames cast warped shadows against stone walls, the king's imagination never rested. And within that imagination, witches became the perfect enemy. They required no armies, no banners, no public presence. They needed only to exist in the dark, spreading harm without leaving clear evidence behind. James did not merely fear this enemy. He contemplated his fear. And then he wrote it down. Demonology was not an innocent book. It was a map of obsession. In its pages, James described devils, witches, and pacts with Satan in the voice of a man utterly convinced that the world was under siege by an invisible foe. He did not write like a detached scholar. He wrote like someone who had stared into the abyss and believed the abyss was staring back. When a king writes about witches, it ceases to be philosophy. It becomes a command. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, a biblical phrase reframed through personal terror, transformed into policy. Witches were no longer a concern of superstitious villages. They became enemies of the state of God, of order itself. To hunt witches was not merely to protect souls, it was to protect the throne. In this role, James bore all the traits of a Gothic figure. His power was sustained not only by law and armies, but by paranoia. Every rumor became a fragment of truth. Every folk tale is a signal. The king required no physical proof to believe in evil. He needed only the sense that it might exist. And once fear is legitimized, it becomes more dangerous than any demon ever imagined. Orders radiated outward from the center of power like cold air. Local magistrates read demonology as a handbook. Clergy preached with heightened urgency. Children, women, the poor, the most vulnerable, suddenly became ideal witnesses because they were believed to be pure, untainted by reason. In a chilling paradox, their fragility was treated as proof of truth, and in distant places like Lancashire, where royal authority was rarely felt directly, those orders were received with particular fervor. There, witch hunting was not only obedience to the king, it was a declaration of loyalty, a way to cleanse a region already viewed with suspicion. In this context, witches did not need to exist. Fear alone was sufficient. Pendle Hill, with its heavy silence, became the perfect ground for that fear to take root. Whispers rising from its base were amplified by those actively searching for signs of evil. And in London, where the king stayed awake, rereading his own demonology, no one heard the wind screaming around Malkin Tower. But it did not matter. The story had already been written in the mind of power long before any trial began. In that world, justice did not seek truth. It sought reassurance, and the fear of a king clothed in faith and law was ready to consume distant villages, impoverished families, and even children who did not yet understand the weight of the words they were about to speak. Pendle did not need devils. It needed only to become the place where an entire kingdom's fear could finally take shape. Great tragedies rarely begin with thunder. They begin with something so small it barely registers a request, a refusal, a single misstep on a narrow road between two villages. That day in Pendle carried no omen of disaster. The sky did not darken suddenly. The wind did not change. There was only Alison Devise, a young woman accustomed to hunger and humiliation, walking the dirt path as she had hundreds of times before. Alison survived by begging, not out of laziness, but because the world around Pendle rarely offered the poor any other choice. She carried with her the habits of a life shaped by rejection, eyes always searching, a voice always braced for contempt. When she encountered the peddler that day, it was not a fateful meeting in any romantic sense. Just two lives crossing briefly, one man with goods wrapped in cloth, one woman with empty hands. Alison asked for a pin, a small thing, ordinary, the kind of object others could give away without thought. But the peddler refused, not cruelly, not with insult. Just a shake of the head, the weary gesture of someone long accustomed to holding tightly to what little he had. To him, it was a meaningless moment on a long road. To Alison, it was yet another confirmation that the world never opened its hand. She turned away, and in that instant, words slipped from her mouth like an old reflex, learned through years of living among whispers and fear. A curse, not in Latin, not in the language of demons, just rough, ordinary words, carrying anger and helplessness. In Pendle, words did not need ceremony to carry weight. They only needed to be believed. The peddler took a few more steps and collapsed. Suddenly, without time to cry out, without understanding what his body was doing to him, he fell onto the dirt road, his hands twitching, his mouth twisted, breath breaking apart. Panic spread. Some ran to fetch help. Others froze their eyes, turning toward Alison. In the world of modern medicine, the story might end here with a cold diagnosis, a stroke, stress, a sudden spike in blood pressure, a chain of biological events unrelated to any spoken words. But Pendle did not live in that world. Here, science had no voice, and even if it had, it would not have been strong enough to drown out a far more compelling story. In the Gothic world, Pendle had become what killed was not a ruptured blood vessel in the brain. What killed was the belief that words had power. Alison believed she had done this. She believed her curse had worked, and once that belief took root, it became more dangerous than truth itself. She turned back toward the dying man. not with the expression of a victor, but with the terror of someone who had just realized she possessed a power she did not understand. Allison knelt, begged for forgiveness, stumbled through the words of regret, but every frantic gesture only perfected the story in the eyes of those watching. An innocent person would flee. A witch would stay because she knew what she had done. News traveled faster than prayer. Along the narrow dirt roads, the story was retold, each time gaining a new detail. Allison had not merely cursed him. She had looked at him strangely. She had spoken words no one could quite hear. The peddler had not simply fallen. He had been struck down by magic. And in Pendle, where everything was already prepared to believe the worst proof was unnecessary, Allison confessed, not because she was tortured, but because she was afraid. In her mind, there was no clear boundary between cause and coincidence. She had grown up in a world where witches existed, where curses were passed along as unquestioned truth. When the man collapsed after her words, how could she believe it was a chance confession to Allison was the only way to make sense of what had happened? A way to name her own terror. And in that moment, the narrow road where the peddler fell became the point where tragedy was set in motion, not because a curse possessed supernatural power, but because an entire community, an entire system, was ready to believe that it did. Allison's words did not kill a man, but the belief that they could open the door to everything that followed. From that narrow road, the story began to climb past villages toward Malkin Tower, and farther still to Lancaster, to London, to the throne itself. And at every step it was dressed more heavily in fear, in authority, in manufactured certainty. Pendle did not need magic to produce a catastrophe. It needed only a moment in which words were believed to carry more power than truth. When the story left the narrow road where the peddler collapsed, it needed someone to carry it farther. Not someone who believed in magic, but someone who knew how to use fear. That man was Roger Nowell. Noel did not enter the story like a demon stepping out of the shadows. He arrived cloaked in law, bearing the king's seal and the language of order. As a local magistrate in Lancashire, he embodied central authority in a region long viewed with suspicion. He was not born in Pendle, did not breathe its stone and fog. He was an outsider, and it was precisely that distance that convinced him he could see more clearly than those who lived there. Roger Nowell was ambitious, not recklessly so, but with a patient, cold ambition shaped by the political and religious opportunities of his time. In an England eager to demonstrate loyalty to King James and the new Protestant order, exposing and suppressing evil was not merely a duty, it was a path upward. When the story of Allison Device reached Nowell, he did not hear the chaos of an accident. He heard potential. A curse, a man collapsing, a poor family surviving through cunning craft. Every piece fit neatly into the picture the crown wanted to see. In London, the king feared conspiracy. In Lancashire, Nowell saw a chance to prove he was doing exactly what the king desired. The investigation began not with the question, what happened, but with who caused it. That difference was lethal. Nowell summoned Allison for questioning. He listened to her confession, but not with the skepticism of a fair judge. He listened with the satisfaction of a man who had just found the first piece of a story he was eager to tell. From Allison, the inquiry spread like a crack through ice. Her grandmother, Old Demdike, a well-known cunning woman, was quickly pulled in. Old grudges, long whispered rumors, and unexplained deaths were dragged out of collective memory. Nowell did not need torture to extract testimony. He needed only to ask the right questions in a world already prepared to answer the way he wanted. In the Gothic logic of power, the monster hunter cannot exist without monsters. And Roger Nowell understood this better than most. Each new accusation did not slow him down. It urged him forward. If one witch could exist, why not a group? If one curse could kill, why not an entire hidden network of evil beneath Pendle Hill? Nowell expanded the investigation, not because evidence led him there, but because ambition pulled him onward. New names were recorded, other families were summoned. Every vague statement was interpreted as confirmation. Every denial was read as proof of concealment. In the world he constructed, silence was guilt, and speaking was guilt as well, so long as it failed to align with the story already decided. Roger Knoll did not believe he was inventing witches. He believed he was exposing them. That is the most dangerous illusion of the monster hunter, the belief that he is a hero. In the dim light of interrogation rooms, with whispers of demonology and the king's mandate echoing in his mind, Noel saw himself as the final barrier between order and chaos. But the monster he hunted had no claws or fangs. It was a story that needed to be fed, and when that story lacked detail or drama, Noel was ready to supply it. If no witch was sufficiently clear, he would assemble one from broken lives. If no devil appeared, he would give it form through testimony and the authority of law. Pendle Hill remained silent, but under Roger Noel's hand, that silence was forced to speak, not with the voice of truth, but with the voice of fear made legal. From that moment on, the hunt was no longer about discovering what had happened. It became a ritual in which monsters had to appear, because without them, the hunter would have no reason to exist. Good Friday in 1612 did not pass over Pendle Hill like a holy day. It crawled across it slow and cold, like a blind creature groping through fog. The sky pressed low against the earth, gray and heavy, as though God himself had turned his face away from this hill. There was no light of redemption, only a suspended sense that something had already been decided, and that today was merely the day it would finally occur. Malkin Tower stood alone on the hillside, like a broken tooth in the rotting jaw of Pendle. It was no tower in any noble sense of the word, just a poor house built of rough stone, damp and sour, always carrying the smell of smoke, sweat, and hunger. But in the imagination of those who had never stepped inside, it had long since transformed into a den of evil, an infected wound waiting to be cut open. Inside Malkin Tower, the Devise family gathered. There were no solemn prayers, no hymns, only people pushed to the margins of society, huddled together like animals in a storm. They came out of fear, out of hunger, out of having nowhere else to go. When the world turns its back, the poor are left only with one another. They ate what they could find, food coarse and heavy with desperation. They shared small portions, shallow cups, as though they knew this might be the last time they would sit together. Stories were told, not for pleasure, but for reassurance. Who had been arrested? Who had vanished? Whose name had surfaced in whispers beyond the walls? With every name spoken, the room seemed to grow darker. The fire in the hearth offered no comfort. It only stretched the shadows, twisting shapes along the walls, until the room appeared crowded with things that did not belong to this world. Malkin Tower needed no demons. Darkness and imagination were more than sufficient. None of them knew that somewhere below the hill, the story of this gathering had already begun living another life. In that version, there was no meager meal, no desperate sharing. There was only a word growing larger in other mouths: Sabbath, Good Friday. The detail cut like a blade. In a world already prepared to believe, the worst timing became evidence. The poor were not permitted to gather on a sacred day. If they did, it meant they were doing something wrong. And if no one knew what the something was, imagination would supply the answer. When the constable and soldiers arrived at Malkin Tower, they asked no questions. They carried conclusions. The door was forced open, wood splintering with a sound like a sentence being pronounced. Torchlight flooded the room, tearing apart the darkness, exposing frozen faces. In that instant, flesh and blood people ceased to be people. They became images. Food on the table became pagan offerings. Fire in the hearth became a ritual flame. Fragmented speech turned into oaths sworn to the devil. Every movement was read as a sign. Every glance became defiance. No explanation was required. Explanation was a privilege reserved for the innocent, and innocence had already been stripped away the moment they were seen together. In the grim logic of the age, poverty itself was suspicious. Poverty gathered together was a threat. A group of people with nothing left to lose has always terrified the powerful. And that terror demanded suppression by turning them into something few would dare defend. The name Malkin Tower was recorded, not as a home, but as a site of evil. The people dragged away were not accused of what they had done, but for where they had been when they had been there, and with whom. Their ordinary lives were peeled away and replaced with an imagined ritual they had never performed. From that moment on, there was no return. Once the everyday is transformed into a satanic rite, all contrary evidence becomes meaningless. Malkin Tower had fulfilled the role power required of it, a stage for fear. A stage where the poor were cast as monsters, so that the rest of society could breathe easier, convinced that evil had a shape, and that shape did not resemble themselves. From Malkin Tower, they were not taken straight to death. They were taken somewhere worse: prison. Lancaster Prison was not a neutral space where justice waited to be decided. It was a slow-grinding machine designed not to hold people but to break them. Before the law killed with a sentence, the prison killed with time, with stench, with decay, with the gradual collapse of body and mind. Its thick stone walls did more than separate prisoners from the outside world. They separated human beings from themselves. Nearly 20 people were crammed into a single confined, dark, damp space. There was no privacy, no silence. One person's breath mixed with another's, heavy with fear and sickness. The floor was always wet, whether from rain seeping through the stone or from waste with nowhere to go. Rats moved freely like the true residents of the place, unafraid of humans. The humans, meanwhile, learned to fear everything. The air in the cell was dense every breath, like swallowing something already rotting. Small wounds never healed. Coughs lingered. Fever, dysentery, infection spread the way rumors do quickly without evidence. Here the body was no longer something to protect. It became proof of inevitable collapse. Night was the worst part. When the little light there was disappeared, darkness brought no rest. It brought sound, moans, whispered prayers, crying pressed down until it became something no longer fully human. Some spoke to the dark because there was no one else left. Others fell completely silent, having learned that words only made things worse. In that space, old Demdike existed like an aging shadow. She did not need torture to suffer. Her body had already been worn thin by life outside. Prison merely finished the work. She coughed, each spasm tearing at her chest. She shook not from cold, but from a body slowly letting go. Those around her watched with a mixture of fear and pity. Some believed she was a witch. Some did not. Inside the prison, belief no longer mattered. Only life draining away did. Old Demdike died in prison before ever reaching the gallows. There was no ritual, no final words. One gray morning, as weak light crept through stone cracks, it became clear she was no longer breathing. Her death was not treated as a tragedy. It was recorded as an administration. One fewer defendant to prosecute. But in the Gothic logic of this place, her death freed no one. It made everything worse, because old Demdike did not die as an innocent woman. She died as a symbol. An old witch dying in prison confirmed every fear society had been nurturing. If she were not a witch, why would she die like this? The prison did not need to answer. It only needed to ask the right question. The prison did not interrogate with whips every day. It is interrogated through endless repetition of despair. Each morning, prisoners woke to realize they were still there. Each night, they understood they would still be there tomorrow. Time lost shape. Day and night bled together. There was no future to imagine, no past to cling to, only a present stretched unbearably long, like a sentence never spoken aloud. In that condition, confession became an imagined escape, not because it promised freedom, but because it promised an ending. When the body aches and the mind collapses, death begins to resemble rest. And if confession is the shortest path there, it ceases to feel like a betrayal of truth. It becomes a final act of self-preservation. The prison extracted confessions, not through open torture, but by making silence unbearable. Guards did not need to threaten. They only needed to suggest that things would be easier if one cooperated. Speak, they said, and God will show mercy. But God in this place was as silent as the stone walls. On paper, the law had not yet killed anyone. In reality, it had begun long before. It was killed by denying sleep, by allowing the disease to spread unchecked, by letting fear reproduce without restraint. When someone finally stood in court and confessed to crimes never committed, it was not a moment of truth. It was the finished product of a process perfected in darkness. The prison became the antechamber to the gallows, not a place where justice waited, but where the soul was prepared for death. Here people learned to let go of names, of memories, and finally of themselves. By the time they walked out to face the crowd and the noose, they had already been dead for a long while. The gallows merely completed the work faster, cleaner, and Pendle Hill, far away, remained silent. It did not object, it did not witness, but inside the stone walls of Lancaster prison, fear had been refined to perfection. The law no longer needed to prove anything. It had the confessions it required, and the price for those words had already been paid, long before any sentence was spoken aloud. When the courtroom doors opened, no one was expecting a child. They were waiting for gaunt women, faces hardened by hunger and fear, bodies twisted by months in prison until guilt seemed to radiate from them without a word being spoken. But the figure who entered that day did not resemble a creature of darkness. She was small, thin, moving slowly her bare feet, making almost no sound against the cold stone floor. Janet Devise, 9 years old. The Lancaster courtroom, already heavy with tension, seemed to lose what little air it had left. A child did not belong here, and yet for that very reason, Janet's presence was terrifyingly perfect. In the religious imagination of the age, children were believed to stand closest to God, untouched by the corruption of adult life. Too innocent to lie with calculation, where adults might deceive children, so it was believed could only speak the truth. Janet was guided to the stand, not the place of the accused, but the place reserved for witnesses. She was so small, the table nearly swallowed her whole. Her hands rested neatly before her. They did not tremble. Her eyes did not search the room for her mother. They looked straight ahead. Calm, so calm, it unsettled the adults watching her. Something about that stillness felt wrong, but no one dared to name it. When Janet began to speak, her voice was clear, measured, unbroken. No crying, no pleading, no hesitation. She spoke of her mother, Elizabeth Devise, as though recounting a story long memorized. She spoke of curses, of meetings in the dark, of names, already familiar to the judges because they had been waiting for them. Mother, siblings, neighbors, acquaintances. No one was spared. Each word fell into the room like a small stone, yet heavy enough to send ripples outward. The accused did not protest. Some were too weak to react. Others no longer believed a reaction mattered. And her mother, the woman who had given Janet life, stood there listening as the child she once taught to speak now used that speech to erase her entire world. There was no hatred in Janet's voice. That made it worse. Had she screamed or sobbed, doubt might have crept in, but Janet simply narrated, as if she were fulfilling a task assigned to her, as if truth, whatever it was merely something to be delivered cleanly and completely. The judges exchanged glances, satisfied. This was exactly what they needed. Accusations from adults could be dismissed as fear or the result of imprisonment, but from a child with no political motive, no ambition, no power. Janet's words carried a moral weight no physical evidence could rival. Within that framework, Janet was not merely a witness. She was an instrument of purification. If evil truly existed in this community, then a child daring to name it proved that God was still watching. Justice, at least in name, had found its voice. Yet a question hovered in the room, unspoken and unacknowledged. Was Janet speaking what she believed, or what the world required her to say? Janet had grown up surrounded by stories of witches, by whispers, suspicious glances, and hungry nights where adults tried to explain their suffering through something supernatural. She lived in a world where magic was believed to be real, where words could kill, and where her mother was both protector and source of collective hatred. When adults asked questions, Janet learned to answer according to the logic she had absorbed since infancy. Then there was the prison, the month Janet watched her mother and relatives confined, treated like animals. She saw old Demdike die. She heard adults whisper that everything would be easier if people simply spoke. In her undeveloped mind, the world divided itself into two sides, those who asked and those who were questioned. To survive, one had to choose carefully. Janet was not tortured with whips. She was tortured with order, with expectant gazes, with questions shaped so that the answers already existed. Each time she said the right thing, no one shouted, no one threatened. That silent approval was the most powerful reward a neglected child could receive. When Janet accused her mother, it was not only betrayal, it was a final severing. A child born on the margins of the world, raised without protection, learns early that family is not always safe. In that courtroom, Janet ceased to be Elizabeth Device's daughter. She became property of the system, and the system used her completely. Every detail Janet provided was carefully recorded. No one asked how a child could remember so much. No one questioned why her words aligned perfectly with what the judges already believed. Such questions were dangerous. They threatened the entire structure, being built out of fear. In that moment, Janet was trusted more than any adult, because in religious thinking, children could not be the source of evil. They could only expose it. That belief transformed Janet into a weapon no one dared challenge. A weapon wearing the face of innocence. When she stepped down from the stand, the room did not feel lighter. It felt heavier, because everyone understood, without saying it aloud, that there was no turning back now. Janet's words had sealed the fate of many, and Janet herself, though still breathing, was trapped in that role forever. The child had stepped onto the table, and at the same time, her childhood had stepped into the grave. Gallows Hill was not born a place for killing. It was merely a bare rise of land, wind cutting straight across open fields beneath a Lancashire sky, forever the color of cold ash. But from that day forward, it ceased to be just a hill. It became a ritual, an open-air altar where people were offered up to fear itself. The morning of the executions arrived in silence. No drums, no public prayers. Only the wind and the sound of soldiers' boots grinding into wet earth. 10 people were led forward, step-by-step ropes, already looped around their necks, as a reminder that words no longer mattered. No one was spared. No mercy was granted. The law had finished its work long before their feet touched the hill. The nooses hung loose and waiting swaying gently like obscene ornaments. They were not tied to kill quickly. There was no falling platform, no clean end. This was not an execution meant to conclude. It was meant to linger, a punishment prolonged long enough for pain to prove itself righteous. As each person was pushed forward, the crowd did not shout. There were no stones, no curses. The crowd stood packed together, dense and silent, like a wall of breathing flesh. That silence was the most terrifying thing of all. It was not mercy, it was consent. When the ropes tightened, death did not come at once. The throat-constricted air cut off, but the heart kept beating. Legs kicked on instinct, fingers clawed at empty space. Faces darkened, eyes bulging as if searching for a question no one was obligated to answer. Death at Gallows Hill did not arrive like a blade. It came like a sermon delivered minute by minute. Some in the crowd could not bear to watch and turned away, yet remained where they stood. Leaving would have been an action, and in that age, action taken at the wrong moment could turn a witness into the accused. So they stayed, heads bowed, silent. That silence was not neutral. It was the final stroke of the sentence. In the thinking of the time hanging was not only a punishment, it was purification. Evil had to be strangled in public to prove that the community itself remained clean. The nooses did not merely kill bodies, they killed doubt. Once the bodies swayed against the gray sky, questions became blasphemy. None of them was allowed to die as ordinary human beings. They had to die as symbols, as warnings, as proof that the world still possessed order, that fear had been brought under control by feeding it blood. Janet Device may have been there. No record confirms it. No record denies it either. In that era, children were often brought to executions as moral lessons. If Janet stood among the crowd, those small eyes would have seen something no sermon could teach, that words can kill and silence can kill again. The bodies were left hanging long enough for everyone to understand that this death was not meant only for them. It was meant for all who lived. Only when legs no longer twitched, when bodies became inert weight, were the ropes cut down. There were no honored coffins, no farewells, just removal from the world of those who had once existed. When it was over, Gallows Hill returned to being a hill. The wind continued. Grass grew back, but the ground had learned how to remember. The place was no longer neutral. It carried the imprint of a day when a community decided that fear mattered more than truth. No one stepped forward to say we may have been wrong, because to admit error would render those deaths meaningless. And no society can endure the thought that it has killed for nothing. Better to believe they were witches than to face the possibility that fear itself had tied the nooses. The ropes were taken down and stored away, waiting for the next time. The law left the hill with clean hands because the blood had soaked into the soil. The church resumed its services. The market reopened. Children continued to be born. But from that day on in Pendle, some stories were no longer spoken aloud, only whispered, as if naming them might bring the evil back, though it had been created by their own hands. And somewhere in collective memory, Gallows Hill ceased to be merely a place of execution. It became a reminder. That is when a crowd remains silent. Long enough, silence will eventually call itself justice. That hanging is not just a death, but a ritual in which people learn to believe they are innocent by watching others die in their place. Gallows Hill fell silent again, but that silence was not an ending. It was only a pause between two long breaths of history. The bodies had been cut down, the ropes stored away, yet something far more persistent than death remained. Words. Not the pleas spoken at the gallows, but the words written down, sealed and placed into the hands of power. In that world, death could erase a person. Testimony could not. The Pendle trial concluded, but it did not close. It carved a wound into English law, an opening wide enough for darkness to seep through. For what truly emerged from those nooses was not merely 10 lifeless bodies, but a precedent. A new principle written in ink and blood children could testify in witchcraft cases. Janet Device left the courtroom long ago, but her voice did not. It was captured, flattened onto paper, framed in official language, and carried farther than she herself could ever travel. The words of a child, fragile by nature, were now armored by the authority of law. Thomas Potts, the court clerk, understood the power of paper well. He did not merely record, he edited, he arranged. He retold the story in the way power wanted it heard. In the wonderful discovery of witches in the county of Lancaster, Janet's testimony was presented as something miraculous, not because it was tragic, but because it was useful. Potts described Janet with cold fascination, a small child standing before the court calm, articulate, unshaken. To him, this was not a sign of trauma. It was proof of truth. In the religious mindset of the age, children were believed to be closer to God than adults, less tainted by deception, less corrupted by desire. If a child spoke, adults believed it was the truth, or at least they needed to believe it was. And that testimony did not remain in Lancashire. 6 years later, another book appeared, Dalton's Country Justice. Not a verdict, but a manual, a guide for local magistrates, men with little formal training but immense authority over life and death. Dalton never saw Janet stand on the table. He only needed to read Potts. In those dry legal pages, the story of Pendle appeared as a model case. Janet was no longer a flesh and blood child. She became a legal footnote, a precedent set in print. A child of 9 years did give evidence upon oath. The sterile phrasing carried a dangerous invitation. Listen to children not to protect them, but to use them. Law, like a living organism, learns from what it has done. And what it learned from Pendle was this: a child's words can kill. From that moment, the door stood open. No elaborate torture was required. No physical proof was necessary. All it took was a child who claimed to have seen, to have heard, to know, and an entire machine could begin to turn crushing adults beneath the wheels of presumed innocence. Janet Device, whether she lived on or vanished from the historical record, continued to exist in another form. She became a legal ghost, haunting courtrooms for centuries to come. Each time a magistrate opened country justice, each time a child was called forward to tell a frightening story, that shadow reappeared. No one spoke Janet's name, but she was there. In New England, decades later, other children would rise. They would tremble, cry, scream, speak of black dogs, night flights, devil's feasts. And judges would nod because the law had permitted them to believe. Salem was not merely an American nightmare. It was a direct descendant of Pendle. In the Gothic logic of history, words never die. They change shape, they change voices, but they always find new bodies to inhabit. Whatever Janet's words were born from belief, fear, or unseen coercion, they escaped her control the instant they were accepted as absolute truth. There is a cruel paradox here. Janet was heard, but not because she was Janet. She was heard because she fit the roles. Society required a child speaking on behalf of adult fear. Her innocence did not protect her. It made her the perfect instrument. In the years that followed, no record shows Janet was rewarded. No trace of a life redeemed. Only cold notes in prison records, suggesting that years later, Janet herself was accused of witchcraft in another case. The machine she helped set in motion turned back toward its origin. That is the nature of testimony that does not die. It is not loyal. It does not protect the one who spoke it. It serves only the system that learned how to wield it. Law in this form requires no malice to become cruel. It needs only memory, a selective memory that preserves useful precedents and forgets the people destroyed to create them. Janet was no longer merely a victim, nor entirely a perpetrator. She became a concept, a case study, a shadow standing behind judges whispering that this had worked before. And that is why her testimony is more frightening than the nooses themselves. Ropes rot, gallows decay, but a sentence once recognized by law can outlive any human being. Pendle Hill still stands. Gallows Hill remains silent. Yet in dim courtrooms, where light filters through narrow, high windows, the shadow of a child continues to step onto the table, repeating her role again and again. No voice required, only precedent. 22 years did not make Pendle forget. Time in this place did not erase. It accumulated. What had happened did not vanish. It settled. It seeped into the soil, into the fog, into stories retold beside hearth fires through countless winters. Gallows Hill still stood bare and silent, like a throat that had swallowed too many lives. Malkin Tower, though reduced to a name, still carried the stench of memory, as if every stone remembered what it had been forced to hold. England had changed. Pendle had not. Fear survived, quiet, durable, waiting for a new voice to wake it. In the winter of 1633, another child stepped out of the dark. Edmund Robinson was 10 years old when he came home late one cold afternoon, clothes smeared with mud, eyes wide as if he had seen something that did not belong to daylight. When adults asked where he had been, he did not speak of mischief. He spoke of gray dogs that changed shape, of night journeys, of houses strung with ropes hanging from the ceiling where food fell from nowhere, like a mockery conjured by the devil. The story did not need logic. It only needed to sound familiar. The adults listened not because they believed every detail, but because they recognized the scent of old fear. The images Edmund described sounded too much like what Pendle had heard 20 years earlier. The boy had not invented darkness. He had reopened a door that had never truly closed. Edmund's father did not stop him. He took his son across the region from one church to the next. The child was placed on raised platforms, turned toward the crowd, and instructed to point. Each lifted finger became an accusation. Each name spoken opened another prison door. The faces below watched in silence, eerily similar to the faces that had once stood beneath Gallows Hill. And then among the whispered names, one surfaced, like a body rising through cold water. Janet Devise. 22 years earlier, Janet had been the child, standing on the table, calm, precise, unshaking. 22 years later, her name was spoken again, not to testify, but to be spoken about. No one mentioned the girl she had been, only the woman who carried the same name, the same shadow. No one knew how Janet had lived in the years between. History does not record the lives of children once they have fulfilled their function. But when she was arrested, a strange sensation settled over Pendle, as if this moment had been waiting patiently, as if the story had never ended, only paused long enough to change who stood at its center. Janet was taken to prison. The same old stone walls, the same damp air, the familiar smell of illness. No prolonged questioning was needed. No elaborate coercion. The existence of the stories was enough. What Edmund described sounded too much like what Janet herself had once said. And to believers, similarity was not a coincidence. It was a sign. Anyone who had once seen the dark was easily suspected of belonging to it. Sitting in her cell, Janet may have understood for the first time a brutal truth. The words she had spoken long ago no longer belonged to her. They had lived lives of their own, passed on, reshaped, stitched together, but never dead. And now they had returned, not needing her voice, not needing her memory, only her name. This time, however, something changed. Edmund's story began to fracture. Taken to London, placed under the gaze of men who did not live beneath Pendle Hill, who were not haunted by its fog or its hangings, his narrative wavered. Details slipped, images overlapped, and finally he confessed he had repeated what he had heard, stories that had drifted through Pendle long before he was born. Janet's stories. The truth did not arrive like salvation. It came quietly, coldly, like a wind extinguishing a candle. Janet was not convicted. She was released. There was no apology, no restitution. The prison door opened and history looked away, pretending it had not touched her a second time. But some wounds do not require a noose to be fatal. Janet stepped out with an understanding no one had taught her that words once believed are not loyal to those who speak them. They wander, they change shape, they seek new mouths, new children, new fears to inhabit. And sometimes they return not to ask questions but to point. Pendle Hill still stands. Wind still crosses Gallows Hill, carrying indistinct sounds like rope brushing wood in the collective memory. Other children will grow up hearing the old stories, absorbing the old fear, and perhaps on some cold afternoon, another child will come home late and begin to speak, not because evil never left, but because words once spoken never truly fall silent. Pendle did not collapse after the Edmund Robinson affair. There was no explosion, no dramatic date etched into history. The world did not change in the way people expected when a great mistake was exposed. It simply cracked, like thick glass under too much pressure. A fine fracture finally appeared, thin, fragile, just wide enough to let light slip through, but not enough to drive the darkness away. That fracture did not take the shape of compassion. It took the shape of science. Far from Pendle, in London, there were people who began asking different questions. Not who is a witch, but what actually kills a person. Not are curses real, but how does the human body function? Among them was a quiet name that would later shake the foundations of Europe's aging worldview, William Harvey. Harvey was not a priest, not a judge. He did not stand at a pulpit of morality, nor did he wield a gavel of judgment. He held a scalpel. He bent over corpses not to search for guilt, but for truth. In an age when death was almost always explained through demons, Harvey saw it as mechanical failure. Heart, blood, pulse. For him, these were not symbols. They were systems. As reports of witches' curses and unexplained deaths poured into London, Harvey and others like him began doing something profoundly dangerous. They examined. No prayers over the dead, no exorcisms, no search for the devil's marks. They opened the body. They found hemorrhaged brains, ruptured blood vessels, hearts that had stopped, signs of stroke exhaustion, disease conditions Pendle had never possessed the language to name. Those who collapsed after a curse carried no trace of demons. They carried biology, but science, still in its infancy, did not enter Pendle as a savior. It arrived as a stranger speaking a language the Hill did not want to hear. To people who had lived their entire lives inside, fear being told there is no evidence brought no comfort. It only stripped away the one thing that had given their suffering meaning. If there are no witches, then death is meaningless. If there are no curses, then who is responsible? Science could not answer that immediately. It could only say, "We do not see the devil here." And in a Gothic world, where darkness had been personified for too long, that statement was nearly as dangerous as an accusation. Pendle did not accept science, but Pendle began to doubt itself. Younger judges read medical reports with discomfort. They did not fully believe them, yet they could no longer fully ignore them. Deaths once attributed to the devil's hand now carried other explanations, colder, more indifferent. No enemy to hang, no ritual to cleanse, only a body that had failed. Fear began to lose its shape, and when fear loses its shape, it begins to weaken. No one announced that the age of witch hunting was over. No law declared the darkness ended. But trials slowed. Children's testimonies were heard with caution rather than reverence. People began to ask, is there evidence beyond words? A question that had once been unnecessary, even blasphemous. Science did not save Janet. It did not save those who died on Gallows Hill. It came too late for them, but it did something else quieter and longer lasting. It broke the seamlessness of blind belief. It punched small holes into it, places where doubt could take refuge. William Harvey never set foot on Pendle Hill, but his shadow, the shadow of method dissection verification, began to settle over the hills like cold mist, not thick enough to erase old memories, but enough to make them uncertain. In a Gothic world, light never arrives like the midday sun. It comes like a candle in a crypt, weak, trembling always, at risk of being extinguished. But once a candle is lit, darkness is no longer absolute. Pendle entered a new era without celebration. Old stories continued to be told. Gallows Hill was still pointed out to children as a warning, but when someone collapsed after an argument, another possibility began to be whispered alongside the curse. And in that hesitation, the power of darkness began to dissolve. Science did not banish demons with magic. It did something more brutal. It made demons unnecessary. And in a world that had survived on fear, this was a slow, painful change, but an irreversible one. Pendle was no longer the center of darkness. It became a relic of a time when words could kill and the silence of the body was ignored. But the crack had opened, and through that crack, something else was looking in, not the light of salvation, but the cold light of truth, which would continue to shine inch by inch until darkness had nowhere left to hide. Truth does not enter the world with ringing bells. It arrives like a crack opening in the night, quiet, uncelebrated, yet enough to make the old structure begin to groan. After science planted a seed of doubt inside blind belief, one more touch was still required, not from scalpels or medical reports, but from the very mouth that had helped ignite the fire. Edmund Robinson spoke again, this time not from the raised platform of a church, not beneath the eager gaze of a crowd. He spoke in a closed room where Gallows Hill did not loom, where fear was no longer fed by collective witnessing. His voice had lost its edge. The details that once soared now fell away like rain-soaked feathers. He confessed that he had lied. Not everything was invented. Some fragments were real stories he had heard, whispers carried on Pendle's wind, images passed from mouth to mouth long before he was born. Edmund did not create the darkness. He picked it up. He assembled it, added the imagination of a child growing up where nights felt longer than days. And then he spoke. He spoke because he was asked. He spoke because he was encouraged. He spoke because he saw adults' eyes brighten with every detail. But behind the child's voice was a larger hand. Edmund's father was dragged into the light, like a stain scrubbed too hard. Journey's payments, promises, each emerged as part of a crude exchange. The child was taken, displayed, and listened to. Every story produced profit. No one needed to name it. Everyone understood fear had been converted into money. The confession did not collapse the world. It made the world hesitate, like an old machine suddenly producing a strange sound, forcing people to listen. Judges who had long trusted children's voices were confronted with an uncomfortable truth. A pure voice does not guarantee truth, and a hand resting on a child's shoulder can weigh more than a noose. But Gothic stories do not allow gentle resolutions. There are two children in this story, two voices, two sets of words that shape the fate of others. Janet and Edmund, one standing on a table to say what adults needed to hear, the other lifted onto platforms to tell what adults wanted to believe. Neither entered the story with power, yet words granted them something close enough to power to be indistinguishable. No child is truly innocent once their words become a weapon. Janet spoke in a world that believed children were too pure to lie. Edmund spoke in a world that still believed that, but had learned how to exploit it. Neither understood the full consequences. Gothic does not care about understanding. It cares only about outcomes. Edmund's confession did not erase the deaths. It did not pull the nooses back from history. It merely exposed the mechanism, a machine driven by fear, requiring words to keep turning. Once words became suspect, the machine faltered. It did not break. It only slowed. Pendle heard the news, and its response fractured. Some felt relief, as if waking from a long nightmare. Others felt anger because the confession stripped meaning from their suffering. If there were no witches, then what were their losses? Biological accidents? Cruel coincidence? For many, that answer was more insulting than any lie. Darkness did not disappear. It relocated. Edmund did not become a hero, nor was he punished as a traitor. He drifted out of the story's center carrying an invisible scar, the knowledge that words can create worlds and destroy them. His father was seen differently now, not as a protector, but as a guide who led his child into a storm and sold tickets to the crowd watching from safety. In private courtrooms, a new word began to circulate: caution. A small word, but in Pendle, it sounded like blasphemy. Caution with children's words. Caution with confessions. Caution with fear retold. Not everyone agreed. But from then on, accusations had to pass through more doors. Gothic does not end with truth. It ends with the heavy silence that follows once truth has been spoken. Two statements, one from Janet, one from Edmund, hung over Pendle, like two shadows that never touched. One had killed, one had been exposed. Neither could be taken back. Both had lived lives of their own, far beyond the mouths of the children who first spoke them. And if any curse was truly broken in this chapter of the story, it was not a witch's curse. It was the curse of absolute innocence, the belief that some voices exist outside power. When that belief cracked, the world did not immediately become better, but it became more cautious, at least for a while. Pendle moved on carrying fragments of its old faith. Winds still crossed Gallows Hill, but crowds no longer gathered as easily as before. Stories were still told, but listeners began to ask a new question: who benefits if this story is believed? In Gothic tradition, breaking a curse does not mean release. It merely transfers the obsession into another form, quieter, subtler, harder to recognize. And there, in the silence between the words of two children, Pendle learned a costly lesson: that truth, when finally acknowledged, does not bring light. It brings the shadow of what has been lost. long and cold, stretching across every road ahead. After Edmund Robinson's confession, Pendle stopped screaming. It fell silent, not the silence of peace, but the silence of a room that has just witnessed something no one knows how to name. The witch-hunting machine slowed, but its gears were still sticky with blood, and at the center of that hollow pause, Janet Device began to disappear. There is no recorded day marking the last time she was seen. No death sentence, no ritual, no crowd gathering beneath the gallows hill. The records simply thin out, then stop. A name that once echoed through the courtroom, once written in heavy ink across depositions, suddenly ceases to appear, as if history, having finished using her, closed the ledger and turned away. Vague notes suggest Janet was held for a short time longer. No one knows how long. Weeks, months, perhaps more. The prison was not a place to wait for justice. It was a place where time finished the work. Cold stone, damp air. Disease drifts like smoke. One could die there without a verdict. Only neglect was required. If Janet died in prison, her death went unmarked. No priest spoke the last rites. No family stood nearby. No name was carved into stone. She left no grave. No patch of earth was claimed as hers. Only walls that remembered a weakening breath, and then none at all. But it is also possible she did not die there. She may have been released quietly, like an error better buried than corrected. A door opened at night. A woman stepped out without papers, without status, without anywhere to return to, carrying a name that had become dangerous. In a land where words had killed Janet Device was a word that could not be taken back. If she lived, it was a different kind of living as a shadow, never staying long, carrying memories no one wished to hear. Every church is a risk. Every conversation is a trap. No one recorded those years. And perhaps that is why history prefers this version. Janet lived, but did not exist. Gothic does not allow a clean ending. It allows only absences. No grave, no final words, no last story told in her own voice. Only the stories told by others. In legal records, Janet's name slowly transforms into an example, a precedent, a warning. No longer a person, but a concept. The child witness, the woman who accused. She is stripped of life and hung inside language. There, she does not age. She does not die. She is not forgiven. She only repeats like a legal ghost. Pendle Hill continues to stand watching over a land that has changed but never fully awakened. Wind still crosses Gallows Hill, though no nooses hang there now. People say that on fog-heavy evenings, the hill seems to whisper not the names of the executed, but the names spoken too early too easily. Janet Device is one of them. No one knows what she thought in her final days, if there were final days at all. Did she regret anything? Or did she simply understand too late that in that world, truth was not what saved you? What saved you, if anything did, was never being forced to speak on behalf of someone else's fear. But Gothic does not permit easy redemption. It permits only continuation. Janet's story does not end where she vanishes. It survives in what was never written down, in the silence of the records, in unanswered questions, and in a cold paradox. The person whose words helped turn history was swallowed by history's silence. No grave means nowhere to mourn. No last words mean nothing final to understand. Only the story, and a story that outlives a human being will never agree to die with him. Pendle moved into another age. Science advanced. Law evolved. Witch trials became an embarrassment in retrospect. Yet whenever the history is told, Janet still appears not as a woman, but as a question. A reminder that some fates are not decided by sentences, but by deliberate forgetting. And perhaps that was the most perfect punishment that the world could offer her. No hanging, no burning, no public spectacle. Only disappearance, line by line, from official memory, while continuing to haunt every story told afterward. If you stand alone on Gallows Hill, at dusk, no one will speak Janet's name. But if you listen long enough, you may hear something else. The sound of a story that was never fully closed. A story without a final period. Only long white spaces where a person once existed, once spoke, once was believed, and then was forgotten. And in that white space, Gothic completes its final circle of obsession, not with a witnessed death, but with a disappearance no one is willing to claim responsibility for. Pendle did not travel on ships. It did not need favorable winds or nautical charts. It crossed the ocean the way darkness always does, clinging to books, memories, and fear carefully packed inside the minds of people who left their homeland to build a new world, never realizing they were carrying an older, darker one with them. Nearly a century after Janet Device vanished from the records on the far side of the Atlantic, a small New England community began to tremble with the same familiar rhythm. Salem had no Pendle Hill, no true Gallows Hill, but it had dense forests, long winters, and a religious obsession even more severe. Here, darkness did not come from old folk legends. It came from the belief that the New World was the final battlefield between God and the devil. And in a room where power gathered in Salem on the judge's table lay an old book, Dalton's Country Justice, not a Bible, not prophecy, but a practical manual, cold, precise, and dangerous. It did not tell stories. It instructed how to turn speech into evidence, how to legalize fear, and how a community could condemn itself while believing it was acting righteously. That book was not written for Salem, but Salem read it as if it had been. The Massachusetts judges did not know who Janet Device was. They did not need to. They knew the structure. They knew that children's testimony carried special weight. They knew that collective panic needed direction, not verification. And they knew that when physical evidence was absent, words spoken the right way were enough. Salem began with children, convulsions, screams in the night, bodies twisting as if pulled by invisible strings. No one asked about illness psychology or the pressure of a society under constant fear. Only one question mattered: who did this? Once asked, that question never stays still. Children pointed. Names were spoken. And just as in Pendle, each name was not only an accusation, it was a temporary relief for the speaker. When pain is assigned to a specific enemy, the world feels more bearable, if only for a moment. Salem built its gallows faster than Pendle ever had, perhaps because it had learned the lesson from afar, that hesitation is dangerous, that doubt breeds chaos, and that darkness must be named before it names you. But the most terrifying thing was not the nooses, it was the familiarity. The accusations in Salem sounded like echoes, descriptions of devils, nocturnal gatherings, black books, invisible marks. Everything had been heard before, written down before, believed before. Pendle did not need to be there. Pendle had been internalized. It lived in language, in legal structure, in the way questions were asked, and the way answers were received. Country justice did not order anyone to die. It merely made killing lawful. And so the curse continued not as a supernatural force, but as a habit of thought. A model that had proven effective fear, speech, verdict, temporary calm. Salem was Pendle, rebuilt in wood instead of stone, with an American Bible replacing English folklore. Some in Salem began to doubt, but doubt in a community obsessed with purity was itself dangerous. Anyone who asked too many questions soon found themselves listed among the answers. And as in Pendle, the truth, when it arrived, came too late to save everyone. It arrived quietly carrying shame rather than liberation. When the frenzy collapsed, Salem did not celebrate. It cleaned up, took down the nooses, closed the records, and began to forget selectively. Pendle never died. It simply learned how to travel farther. That darkness crossed the ocean, not because it was powerful, but because it was convenient. It gave frightened communities a simple story. Judges are a tool. The suffering is someone to blame, and history is a way to repeat itself without admitting it was doing so. Salem became the symbol. Pendle became the footnote. But the two were bound by an invisible rope, the rope of words believed, without proof, of children placed on platforms, too early, of books used as talismans rather than tools. Looking back, people like to believe Salem was an isolated mistake, a temporary fever in early American history. But the darker truth is this: Salem was just another chapter in the same book opened in Pendle nearly a century earlier, and that book was never burned. It still sits in libraries, in legal precedents, in collective memory, waiting for another moment, another place, another fear large enough to need it. Darkness does not need belief in witches to survive. It only needs people to believe that sometimes hanging someone will make the world easier to breathe in. And that is the real curse, the one that left Pendle, crossed the sea and found a new home in Salem. Not for the last time. There is no ending clean enough to close a story like this. Pendle did not end at Gallows Hill. Salem did not end when the nooses were taken down. And Janet Devise did not end when her name vanished from the records. Stories like these do not die. They retreat. They wait. And when humanity finds a new fear that feels familiar enough, they return without pointed hats, without spells, needing only a different name. Look around, not toward the forest, not toward the hill. Look instead at the brightest places, the ones lit day and night. Our century prides itself on having buried witches along with the Middle Ages. We have science forensics and data. Yet every time collective fear rises, a terrorist attack, a strange illness, a moral panic, the old question returns in modern language. Who did this? And just as before, the question does not seek an answer. It seeks a container. Once it was the poor, the foreign, the ones living outside sanctioned belief. Today, it may be a group, a neighborhood, a religion, or an opinion. We do not call it witch hunting. We call it security order accountability. But the structure remains unchanged. Accusations travel faster than evidence. Outrage spreads faster than truth. And the crowd, always convinced it stands on the side of light, moves forward in silent agreement. The media becomes the courtroom. News feeds become the noose. A sentence stripped of context can outlive a human life. An accusation, even when retracted, leaves its mark. Like old verdicts, it does not need to be correct. It only needs to be believed long enough. In Pendle, people believed words could kill. In Salem, they believed the devil could speak through children. In our time, people believe images, headlines, and fragments can stand in for the whole truth. Every era invents its own language for fear. Fear itself never changes. The most frightening thing is not that we are still afraid. It is that we still need someone to be afraid in our place. Remember Janet, a child standing on a table, speaking clearly before adults who believed purity lived in an unbroken voice. She did not need to understand the full consequences to become its instrument. She only needed to speak, to be believed, and those words written down, sealed, printed into books, traveled farther than any ship. Today, we do not place children on wooden platforms in courtrooms. We place them on screens. We borrow innocence, real or staged, to reinforce a story already chosen. When a young face says what we want to hear, we call it an obvious truth. When they say something uncomfortable, we call it confusion. No child is truly innocent in these stories, not because children are cruel, but because adults place on their shoulders a role they cannot refuse. And there are no judges who are purely monstrous. Most believe they are protecting their communities, like Roger Newell, like the men who signed orders in Salem, like the voices today calling for swift, decisive action before truth has time to breathe. We like to believe we are different. That history has taught us enough. But history does not teach, it records. Humans are the ones meant to learn, and we usually do so only after the price has already been paid. Perhaps the question, who is the witch, has always been asked the wrong way. It assumes the witch is a person, an individual, a being that can be pointed at, bound, and removed. But if Pendle, Salem, and every place between have shown us anything, it is this: the witch is rarely a specific person. The witch is an empty position, filled whenever society needs a shape for its fear. Today, it is they. Tomorrow, it may be you. That position never lacks candidates, because fear never lacks reasons. And so the only conclusion that can be honest conclusion is no conclusion at all. No tidy moral verdict. No clean line between villain and innocent. Only cycles. Words, books reopened, and communities that each time believing themselves different step once more into the same old room, only the lighting changed. Witches do not live in the forest. Witches do not live on the hill. Witches do not hide in the natural darkness of the world. Witches live in the fear that humans choose to believe.